study today. And what we're going into is we did our first study, which was on the Endor's Wicked Witch. We're getting into the Halloween Rightly Divided studies, getting ready for that October 31st, where you have these different topics you can talk about with people when it comes to fall or Halloween or things like that, as that's coming up for us. We went through Endor's Wicked Witch, which was in 1 Samuel chapter 28. This time we're going to go into something a little bit different, which is in Proverbs chapter 25. And we'll see this in verse 11. Proverbs 25, verse 11, which pretty much says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. So we're going to build on that because, during this time of year, there's all sorts of different activities that take place for the autumn season, the fall season, the Halloween season. One of them is bobbing for apples. So we figure we got some apples right here, which is apples of gold. And so we'll build on that because essentially what we're looking at here is talking about our words and our speech, and especially for us as Pauline, dispensational Bible believers and the dispensation of grace, it's good to always have a study to make sure we know about, words fitly spoken and how our speech is meant to work for us in the dispensation of grace. Bobbing for apples of gold, we're going to delve into the profound insights contained in, say, Proverbs 25, also in Colossians 4:6. We'll take a look at that because we want to build on that today. So we're going to be looking at, just as golden apples stand out in their setting, our words, when thoughtfully selected, when intentionally made, can hold immeasurable value. So that immeasurable value, those apples of gold and pictures of silver, can do very well. So we're going to take a look at that. And so when we use our words to uplift and inspire, and when we use our words to present grace in the situations that we come across every day, it's going to either build up or tear down based on how much we understand what we're doing. And so we want to remember the importance of speaking, say life, grace, encouragement, and kindness to those around us. So we just saw a little bit about this in Proverbs 25, verse 11, about a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. And that's a good lesson. That's a good spiritual nugget we want. And how great is a word fitly spoken? We also want to look at Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. So we want to see what Paul has to say about it. So Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, see a little bit more about it. And what we see here is what Paul has to say about it. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6 says, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. Paul says this. And so as we kind of break down what he's saying here, this is the verse we're really going to zoom in on. And we'll go back to Proverbs 25:11 as well, as we're kind of bobbing for apples of gold here. But he says in Colossians 4, verse 6, he says, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. And so as he goes through this, let your speech, in this dispensation, let your speech be always with grace. It's not supposed to be a storm of, per se, cuss words like you hear on all sorts of different medias and televisions and such. But neither is it supposed to be a bunch of sugar-coated messages like you hear in a bunch of religious messages as well. It's not supposed to be that either. But words fitting that are of sound doctrine, doctrinal content, and dispensational understanding. If you look at, say, Titus chapter 1, Titus chapter 1, verse 9 has a good, cross-reference for this. We'll see this here in Titus chapter 1, verse 9. It says two things that we can do with sound speech, two things we can do with our words and our speech, as we're kind of looking for those apples of gold, words fitly spoken in day-to-day content. It says, holding fast the faithful word as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayer. So you want to be able to exhort and you want to be able to convince with sound doctrine. If you don't have sound doctrine, if you don't know what that is, if you don't know where to find it, if you don't know what to do with it, you're not going to be able to convince anybody of anything, and you're not going to be able to exhort anybody. And so we see this here. And so the ambassador, today, the grace ambassador, the Bible believer is supposed to, of necessity, behave. And so conduct in our speech is definitely going to be a part of that. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, speech is just a part of that. It's not all of it, but it is a part of it. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. And what we see here says, Paul says to Timothy, he says, but if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And so people say, well, I'm saved by grace, so I can go ahead and do this, and I can go ahead and just do whatever I feel like. And of course, Romans 6 has a lot to say about that. A lot of people say, well, I don't need to go out there and evangelize, and I don't need to go out there and do anything for the Lord per se. I'm saved. I can do anything I want. I can speak how I want. I can do anything I feel like. But Paul says that you ought to know how thou oughtest to behave thyself. He says that. He says that to Timothy, and that applies to all of us. We ought to know how we ought to behave ourselves, not just when people are around, but when people aren't around. And he says that thou oughtest know how to behave thyself, and that includes our words, that includes our speech. But if anything, we think about how they should be, if anything, like apples of gold. They should be a word fitly spoken. They should be, as we see here, our speech in this dispensation should be always with grace. And so we see that there. They shouldn't be, if we look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 2, there should be no murmuring in there. Philippians chapter 2, verse 2, as we go there. That's a little bit of a tough thing for some, but Philippians 2:2, he says, fulfill ye my joy, that ye may be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man on the things of others. He goes through and he mentions this here. And we see, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And so he says, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. Goes through and he says this. If you look at verse 14, Philippians chapter 2, he says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. Now, if you can understand that our behavior is supposed to be right, our speech is supposed to be right. And so there's things we are supposed to do and include. There's some things we're also supposed to put off and not include. Do all things without. There's some things we do without murmurings and without disputings. So we can, of course, it's not that we're to be a welcome mat for anybody to do anything to us, but we can, every time we do something, it's not that we have murmurings every time we do it and disputings. If we do have a boss at our job, if we do have, a order and a structure to, what is, in our lives, we do things without murmurings. We do things without disputings. If you are murmuring and clamoring and disputing and upset about everything, you may want to consider studying Philippians chapter 2 again, and as well as the book of Titus again, and as well as a couple of other things, Colossians, and see what Paul is saying about our behavior and our speech and so forth. And so this is what we're seeing here in Philippians chapter 2, as it's saying the ambassador is to behave when it comes to this. And so this is what he was talking about when he came to the idea of no cuss words per se, no storm of that, no big riled up event of this. And so they was talking about this, but they also said no sugar-coated messages as well. And religion is filled with that. Look at Romans chapter 16 and verse 17. Romans 16, verse 17. And when we say this, it's not a legalistic thing when we're saying it's like no cuss words or you're going to end up in hell. It's no cuss words because it's the right thing to do. You ought to know how to behave yourself. Romans chapter 16, verse 17. It says, now I beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which ye have learned, and avoid them. For they that are such serve not our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by good words and fair speeches deceive the hearts of the simple. So there's a lot of different preachers and pastors and teachers using their speech to deceive, using their speech to corrupt, using their speech not to encourage or to teach or to instruct, but to deceive the hearts of the simple. And they're doing it through good words and fair speeches. So the good words that people are hearing and the fair speech, they're good and they're fair. They really know what they're saying in order to deceive, in order to steal, in order to kill, in order to destroy, in order to take, in order to corrupt. They're good. those speeches, I mean, they sound amazing, but that's all wrong. It's all incorrect. It's all bad. And he goes forth and he says this: mark them, which cause divisions and offenses, contrary to the doctrine which ye have learned. This is from Paul. You got to take that, mark them, and understand. And so here's a famous quote, and we'll say who this is from at the end. He says, I just want to encourage every one of us to realize when we obey God, we're not doing it for God. I mean, that's one way to look at it. We're doing it for ourselves because God takes pleasure when we're happy. And that's from Joel Osteen's wife, Victoria Osteen, when she said it to a multitude of thousands, maybe 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people, or more, 10,000 people in her megachurch, or their megachurch, saying that, when you do something, do it for yourself. Don't do it for God. Because God likes it when you do things for yourself. And so people were just like, yay, clapping and loving what she was saying, not paying attention to the fact that this was a rotten apple. This was not an apple of gold. It was a completely rotten apple, and nobody had a clue. So you have that. But as we go back to Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, see the verse that we're looking at. And so what we saw was, let your speech be always with grace. And we saw that it needs to be always with grace. It needs to be not sugar-coated, and it doesn't need to be filled with anger and clamor and murmuring and disputing. But it does also need to be seasoned with salt, and salt is meant to flavor, and salt is meant to be sharp. So you can be sharp in what you say with grace. You can, with grace, if you see a 5-year-old trying to stick a metal fork into an electric socket, you can, with grace, say, stop it. Don't do that. That's wrong. That's incorrect. And you can, with salt, sharpen them up. Let them know. And so with doctrinal content, you can say, no. Water baptism is absolutely incorrect. It's not for this dispensation. Paul would not be doing this today. This is not how things are supposed to go. You can have your speech seasoned with salt and allow the individual to understand why that is, and teach as necessary. You can preserve. Salt preserves from corruption. That's what your speech is supposed to be doing. Render wholesome, let our speech be so with correct doctrinal speaking. And that's what you can do with your speech. That's where you can go as you go out there and teach and speak. Let your speech be seasoned with salt so that it teaches others, and it informs others, and it corrects others, and it warns others about what's out there, because a lot of people don't know. And so even that, a word fitly spoken, even seasoned with salt, is going to go out there and sharpen them up. And so some examples, if you look at Ephesians 4:29, Paul continues on with this. And he says that our very speech should be oriented towards what Christ has done for others, on the cross. And the focus should be on that, not ourselves. He says in Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. So a lot of people like to think that, well, God wants me to agree with everybody and be nice to everybody and be kind to everybody, even those that are corrupt, even those that are wicked, even those that are, choosing to do wrong. And that's not so. If they're choosing to do wrong, you can speak up. You can speak and say things, and that is God's will, according to Ephesians 4:29. And let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. So we see that there. If you look at Titus chapter 2, in verse 3. Titus chapter 2, in verse 3, when it comes to speech as well, having those apples of gold, a word fitly spoken, grace age speech. You see, it says that the aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. So 2 things in that verse is that they're not false accusers, and that their speech doesn't reflect that. But 2, that they're teachers of good things, that they teach good things. And so that's a thing that when it comes to aged women, that they teach good things. So that's something that we see there in the book of Titus. That's what they would do. If we look at Ephesians 5:4, staying in Ephesians there, if we're still there, when it comes to their speech, it says, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. Our speech should be about, thanksgiving or the giving of thanks. It says, not foolish talking, nor jesting. Now, when you go through that a lot, you'll find that your speech becomes goofy, your speech becomes corrupted, your speech becomes, well, I was just kidding, I didn't really mean that, I wouldn't, and then you start backpedaling from whatever the joke was, from whatever your speech was, and you're mostly, instead of trying to get the gospel of the grace of God out, instead of trying to preach the word of truth out and teach about right division, teach about Paul, you made some joke that someone didn't like, that someone didn't get, and instead you're trying to back them. Now you say, oh, I didn't really mean that, and I'm sorry, and if I could just tell you about the grace of God, and by then they don't want to hear it. It's not convenient. You've made a situation not convenient. That's what you're seeing in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 4. Neither foolish talking nor jesting, which are not convenient. You're the ambassador on the scene trying to see souls saved. If you've said something that's a joke, and people either want to hear more of it, or they just didn't like what they heard and they want to hear less of it, it's harder to get the gospel out that way. Just get the gospel out. And rather giving of thanks, that type of thing. If we look at Titus chapter 2, verse 8, we see the kind of speech that Titus continues to talk about. Titus chapter 2, verse 8 says, sound speech. That's where the believer needs to be. That's where the ambassador needs to be, with sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. And so it's the sound speech that you want to have. It's sound speech that you want to have that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part. There's going to be people that are contrary to you, contrary to the grace of God, contrary to the Bible, contrary to Paul, that are going to try to get you on something. And when you have sound speech and you know how to use it, and you know how to, and it's not so much as it's a fighting match. You're not always going to try to win the argument. Sometimes you may need to back off and allow them turn it into a listening thing, and you're going to listen, and you're going to turn it into a questioning thing, where the person who is just strong-minded and strong-willed, and they're that strong atheist who's never going to say that the Bible is right. Now you're going to turn into a listener, and you're going to say, well, tell me why you think that, and let me ask you some questions about your position on what you believe. And you're going to turn your speech into sound speech, which is a bunch of questions where you can ask them questions. Well, what do you believe about the miracle of Jesus' resurrection? What do you believe about this? What do you believe? You're not trying to outwin them in every argument, because they're not there yet. They're not willing to, but you still want to have that conversation. So sound speech that cannot be condemned, that's where you want to be at. So that we can normalize boldly speaking and preaching the gospel of Christ, which is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. The mystery of Christ, which you find in Ephesians 6:20, and all throughout Paul's epistles. And as we bring it back to Colossians, we're still in that verse of Colossians 4:6. Let our speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. We've got that far in the verse, as we're kind of breaking it down and kind of putting it together with the spiritual lesson of apples of gold, a word fitly spoken. He says here, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, puts the comma there, so we can say that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. And so as he goes through, you ought to know how you ought to answer every man. We need to intentionally and on purpose, be prepared. If we're going to go out there and we're going to evangelize to, if we're going to go out into the park, that there's going to be a mixture of different people. There's going to be Catholics, there's going to be atheists, there's going to be Seventh-day Adventists, there's going to be Jehovah's Witnesses. There's going to be a whole bunch of people out there, and you just have to be prepared with your speech to be ready to answer. Dates, times, people, places, doctrines, beliefs. And you may not know everything, but you can have at least the bulk of it ready to go, and in hopes of having a verse ready, the gospel ready, different things ready. And you'll get hit from all sorts of different sides, but you want to be ready for as much as you can. And that way, as you do this, at least you'll have the idea that you'll know how you ought to answer every man, and so you have that ready to go. So essentially, you asked, do you know how we ought to? So how do we know how we ought to answer? And of course, it always comes back to where we've been going so far, and that's the book of Titus. Titus chapter 1, verse 9. Titus 1 again tells us the same thing, that holding fast the faithful word, uh, as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine. If you want to know how you ought to answer every man, it's by sound doctrine. And once you have that sound doctrine in your inner man, once you study that sound doctrine, and once you understand and adhere to that sound doctrine, and you're plugging it into your inner man, and you're studying to show yourself approved, 2 Timothy 2:15, and you're logging into that sound doctrine, loading up on that sound doctrine, you'll be able to exhort and convince the gainsayers, as we were saying before. So you go through and you do that, and so it's going to help you on your evangelism. And convince and exhort. Exhorts is to charge or to press or to push. And so you want to consider your approach on who it is you're speaking with. So, so you want to take the Bible believing position on all issues, because salvation comes first. That's 1 Timothy 2:4. We want to see souls saved and see saints edified. And we want to make it about Christ, and we want to make it about edifying. You don't want to make it about how many arguments can I win today. And you don't want to walk away from the park, or you don't want to walk away from the mall, or you don't want to walk away from the crowd saying, well, I really showed these guys that I know more than them, and I know more Bible than them, and I'm better than them, because that's not how you want to walk away from an evangelism session. You want to walk away saying that I had some great conversations, and that there's some things that they're thinking about, and maybe there's something I'm thinking about, but as long as it's not turning you away from Paul, turning you away from the Bible rightly divided, if you're giving them some things to think about, that's where you want to be at. So you want to convince, exhort, and convince, as Titus chapter 1:9 talks about. You want to warn the unruly, as Timothy talks about, when you convince them. And we're here to make all men see, not agree or believe. If you look at Ephesians 3:9, that's what Paul says. Ephesians chapter 3, in verse 9. Paul says, and to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hidden God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. He says he's here to make all men see it. So when you go out there and you go to convince, and you go to exhort, and you go to preach, and you go to evangelize, you're there to make all men see it. You're not there to win the argument and get their arms behind their back and say, how am I going to mentally wrestle their minds from their position? How am I going to win them over? I hope they don't try to win me over before I win them over. And what are they going to say? So and this pressure is on there. How is this battle going to take place? You're going to present the information, and what they do with the information that you present to them, that's going to be up to them, because you're presenting the information of the fellowship of the mystery. You're presenting the information of the word of truth rightly divided. You're presenting the information of the gospel of the grace of God, and you're presenting the information of Jesus Christ preached according to the revelation of the mystery. What they do with it is up to them. And there's a multitude of different scenarios of what they can do with it, but that's their choice. So that's what they do. And what happens next is up to them. They have the free will, just like we had the free will and we believed it. And so nonetheless, it's good to know what we should say and prepare for time and be ready to convince and exhort, be ready to go. And that's where our speech comes in. And that when we have a word fitly spoken, ready to go, and when we have words that are good and right and truthful and exhorting and edifying with grace, then that's going to be good. Seasoned with salt, that's what we want. So our approach with people of strong opinions should change from teaching to listening, as we said earlier, and let them speak. The more they talk, the more they talk, the less persuaded they may become if you ask the right questions. You just want to be asking the right questions as they're talking. Resist the temptation to even answer for them. And so it's all about all of us by studying. Of course, 2 Timothy 2:15. It's necessary for us to study today. We need to do this. We want to take the Bible literally as we study and profit to learn how to use the Bible so we can load up on our information. Right words used the right way are going to be wonderful. There's going to be those apples of gold. Again, bobbing for apples and getting those apples of gold. And as we go into those conversations and reach out to people and talk to them, is what we want. It's why we study. It's what we do, why we do. It's how we want to get our speech seasoned with salt and ready to go. The person speaking deserves to know this. But if we look even through Proverbs, we'll look at some of the Proverbs and see how this builds upon this. We look at Proverbs chapter 15, verse 23. We'll get some spiritual lessons now out of Proverbs, since we're kind of going back and forth some of this. It was Proverbs 15, verse 23. It says that for Proverbs, it says, a man hath joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good is it? So again, referring to this, good spiritual lessons we can understand from this. We're not under law. We're not in Solomon's kingdom. We're not in prophecy, and we're not in the dispensation of law. But again, a man hath joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good is it? And that's a truthful statement there. If we look at verse 26, it says, the thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. So even the words of the pure are pleasant words. And we see just a spiritual lesson out of that. If we look at Proverbs 16, verse 13, it says, righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him that speaketh right. So we see this, again, a good spiritual lesson there. Proverbs 16:13, and then verse 24 says, pleasant words are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. So again, Solomon making notes for us to read thousands of years later, good spiritual lessons out of this. If we look at Proverbs 22:11, it says, he that loveth pureness of heart, for the grace of his lips, the king shall be his friend. So we see this in 22:11. And even Ecclesiastes 12:10, I believe it is. A couple verses down, one more book down, Ecclesiastes 12:10. Says the preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as golds and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And it kind of goes on just talking about all this, but you're seeing how words are important things. Words are, especially, words fitly spoken are like apples of gold, as you see in Proverbs, and all these different Proverbs are giving all these spiritual lessons about how right words are extremely beneficial. Use your words correctly. Use your words correctly, speak them rightly, use them at a fitly time, and you'll be really good to go. So we see that there. But we want to walk in wisdom, especially in Colossians 4:5, by wisening up our speech. That word fitly spoken may communicate support, agreement, and it can also be that necessary rebuke that you need in a certain situation, depending on what it is. It may bring about comfort, exhortation, guidance, or encouragement. And you just don't want it to be those sweet, sugary sounded words. Those just people won't respect that as much. So we go back to Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 11 again. It's going to touch on that a little bit more. Again, Proverbs 25:11 was a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. So again, that word fitly spoken, again, words that are timely and appropriate and well chosen for particular situations. Speaking that way is suitable, effective, and considerate, and they have that positive impact characterized by wisdom, kindness, and tact. And we went through all the different Proverbs just a moment ago, seeing those are good cross references for this verse. Proverbs 25:11 is also good for Proverbs 15:23, Proverbs 15:26, Proverbs 16:13, Proverbs 16:24, and Proverbs 22:11. Solomon has said it a couple times how good this uh, fitly words or timely words and good speech works out. Even Paul does. But That word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. So he kind of uses that parallel to talk about what was in his modern day, apples of gold and pictures of silver. So he talks about how it's something precious and desirable, like a literal golden apple. And so, that golden apple, and it's gold is associated with, wealth and beauty and so forth. But the pictures of silver talks about like a crafted and ornamental setting, like a container just made out of silver that the apple would be presented on. It would be something so incredible, so wonderful to have and to see and to enjoy. It would symbolize something that's beautifully encased or so forth. So it paints a picture of something that's valuable, something that's beautiful, that word fitly spoken, or those apples of gold and pictures of silver. The message is one that's highly valuable, highlighting the beauty and preciousness of well-spoken and well-timed words. So we see that in the context of the verse. It just leads to the impact of your words, whether it's Colossians 4:6, Proverbs 25:11. The words we use today are very important. So when we're bobbing for apples of gold, we want to make sure that we're deciding that the words that we say make that right impact in the multitude of different situations we go out into as ambassadors of God's grace. Especially during this, Halloween season. As we're coming up to Halloween, we can think about all the different ways, whether it was our previous study that we had done on the Witch of Endor, or whether it was the one that we're doing now, Apples of Gold, or the ones that we're going to have coming up. There's subjects, there's topics you can relate to and communicate with the person who has no desire to learn the Bible. Now you can start talking about things that are in the Bible with the individual. That's why we're having these studies. We're not promoting Halloween, we're promoting communication and evangelism with the people who are lost. And if we can use this, we'll go. We want to jump right into the gospel, but we're also having a multitude of different communications as well. That's what we want. So, without doing this, all you're going to have is unsound doctrine and unsound communication. And it's a reason why people have also begun to, in the first place, reject sound doctrine, reject the Bible, reject getting into the word of truth in the first place. They've heard too many things that have driven them off, like that quote earlier from Victoria Osteen. They've just heard too much that didn't make sense, that sounded too sugary, that sounded too goofy, that sounded too unsound and wrong and bad. And they just said, this is not for me. And this is why it's let them off in the first place. Words unfitly spoken have turned them off and turned them away. If you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, 2 Timothy 4, verse 3, the result of unfit words, the result of unsound doctrine, it's brought people to this point, and a lot more than just this, but for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. And I believe that this is well now into this time now where people, they'll hear the truth. We'll go out there and tell them the truth. And they'll say, yeah, you sound right, but I'm still going into the filthiness and the unsound doctrine and the incorrect information because it just fits my lusts better. It just fits my incorrect lifestyle better. It just fits my ungodliness better. The world around me is catering to my ungodliness, and so I'm going that route. Even though what you're saying, I can't find anything to say. Your sound speech cannot be condemned. I can't find anything wrong with what you're saying, but I'm going this route. So they turn away their ears from the truth. And so you'll even hear gospels that teach works or salvation by works. They'll go into James 2, they'll go into all these other things. And so many so called ministers of righteousness will teach whatever doctrine pleases their congregation, but in so doing, they turn from the truth. These men are unfaithful hirelings and they have to be reproved. Look at 2 Timothy 1:13. 2 Timothy 1:13, being about sound words, we see here it says, hold fast the form of sound words which thou hast heard of me in faith and love which is in Christ Jesus. And so he's talking about hold fast the form of sound words. When we're out there with our speech, when we're out there doing what we do, we want to hold fast the form of sound words with sound doctrine, doing all the things that we do with evangelism and otherwise. Without sound doctrine, Christianity is just another religious practice with empty traditions and cheap emotionalism and a meaningless list of rules that really doesn't mean anything. That's how most people, unfortunately, view it today. As show up at the building, 10 o'clock on Sunday, wear a nice suit, wear whatever you got to wear, do what you got to do, get through it, smile, feel emotionally good, and walk out of there and repeat next Sunday. So as we kind of go through this and kind of go through everything in this season, specifically not just in every season, in season, out of season, we don't want to forget the what we're doing here. We want to be mindful of planting seeds of kindness, grace, and encouragement. And you're trusting that just like in Galatians 6:9, we reap what we sow. And as we plant good words of truth, good words of encouragement and grace, seasoned with salt and everything else, that it's going to reap into the lives of those that are around us. We want to make sure that we're sowing the gospel everywhere we go, and that we embrace the wisdom of Proverbs 25:11. As we go out there, that we bob for apples of gold per se, and let our words shine brightly in the silver frames of our lives per se, bringing joy, comfort, and hope to those that we encounter. So we kind of wanted to go through that, make sure we present the information, bobbing for apples of gold. And it's just kind of a touch up on Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, making sure we understand that we let our speech be seasoned with salt, and that we know how we ought to answer every man. Proverbs gives us a lot of information on that. Colossians gives us a lot of information on that. Titus gives us a lot of information on that. And pretty much Paul gives us a lot of information on that, because God gives us a lot of information. Our speech means a lot, and we can break people down or we can build them up based on what it is that we're saying. So with that, we want to press on, and we want to go forth and see souls saved and see saints edified, mostly by presenting the information we use in our speech. So with that, we'll stop with bobbing for apples of gold in Proverbs 25:11. We'll see if there's any kind of thoughts or questions on anything, and or comments, and we'll kind of go from there. Good studies.
What is bobbing?
Well, bobbing is a thing where it's a Halloween tradition where you kind of put your hands behind your back and you have like a bucket of water with apples in it, and you go down with your mouth and you pick the apple up with your mouth. It's just a Halloween. It's a game.
It's a game.
It's a game.
It's a party game.
Yeah. So when you put this in the study, the apples of gold is what Solomon said was a good word. If you say something really good, it's like eating an apple of gold, or it's like an apple of gold.
Mm.
And the same thing with what Halloween is doing is people bob for apples. So we put the two together into this study of how we want to say the right thing, a word fitly spoken, and our grace aid speech. We want to have the right speech for the right people at the right time so that we can get them saved with the gospel. And so that's how we would use that, is and kind of cater to the season that we're in of Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
Not because we like Halloween, but because that's just where we are. And hopefully people that see our website will watch this and learn from this and benefit from what Paul has to say about this. So that was a good question. But yeah, anything, other thoughts or comments or anything? So yeah, we'll be back with another study. We'll go forth and we'll do that on another date, another time. And we're going to wrap up here, and we'll be back, and we'll continue doing more of Halloween rightly divided studies. We'll get more into them, and we'll do more later. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. We'll stop here.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, we'll see everyone later.
Don't forget to subscribe.
See everyone another time.